All right. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm the dramatic historian, and we're lucky enough today to actually have Jonathan Noyalas on to actually talk about his book, General Philip Sheridan, Life, War, and Memory. So thank you for coming on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Nate. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, to begin, it's not necessarily a question about anything you wrote in the book itself, but I'm really curious about the painting on the front cover of it because
Yeah,
I've never seen it before, and I'm like, okay, that's new to me. So, what could you tell me a little bit about it?
yeah. You know, publishers very rarely let the author choose the art for the cover, but in this instance, Rutledge reached out to me and said, what recommendations do you have? And so I sent them, several different choices, and ultimately they settled on this one. And this is one that I was kind of pushing for because it was done by a Chicago-based artist. In 1890, it came out, and so it's maybe not the best artistic likeness of Sheridan, right? Because it shows him like it's supposed to depict Sheridan at Cedar Creek, so like he is older and has all of his decorations at his as commanding general of the army. But I really liked it because it was done by a Chicago artist.
Okay.
And of all the places that Sheridan ever lived in his life, Chicago was the place he loved the most. And so I
Yeah.
thought that was a nice little, a subtle nod to that.
Yes. Well, Irene probably would have had something to say about it, but
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
sure enough, it's a great image. I've never seen it before. I think it's a great piece.
Mhm.
So to just kind of start off, I do you think you could talk a little bit about his upbringing? I always imagined him as more of like this ornery kid because he got suspended from West Point for getting into a fight and everything else. So I kind of imagine this wily kid, but it really doesn't seem that way, except
Yeah.
for the instance of the bucket of water. But
Yeah. I mean, like all kids, he has his moments. So, I mean, there's a
yeah,
moment where he's like sick and tired, as his friends are in Somerset, of getting, whipped by the teacher. And so, he lashes out with a bucket of water on the teacher's head. And then there's this chase that takes place. But yeah, as he's growing up in Somerset, Phil Sheridan really becomes enamored from a young age with all things military. He is, and I argue in the book that one of the most transformative moments in his life comes early in his existence. He's probably 7 or 8 years old, and he sees a Revolutionary War. There's a 4th of July celebration. He sees a Revolutionary War veteran, William Dusenberry, being paraded through the streets of Somerset. And, you have all this fanfare going on, fireworks and music and parades and games and all that kind of stuff. And Sheridan's just focused in on this. And that is the thing where Sheridan, begins to really admire military service, begins to appreciate and kind of cultivate in himself a sense of love and admiration for the United States, his patriotism. And then it just takes off from there. One of the things that's really striking to me about his early life, people who knew him, like reflecting back after he had become, popular during the Civil War and beyond, remembered him like, he had a tin sword and he's out there drilling a company of young kids. And so he was really, truly obsessed with that all throughout his life. And I felt like, as you watch the trajectory of his childhood, you kind of get the sense of like, this is what he wants to be. Like, he wants to be a military officer. And then you get to this moment in time where he's, 14, 15 years old, and he's thinking it's probably not going to happen. And then, of course, you have that opening, comes about when one of the Ewing boys is booted out of West Point, and Sheridan gets that appointment.
yeah. Well, it seems like when he goes off to West Point, it seems like he actually, again, this was news to me, and I was a little bit
Mhm.
surprised by it. It seems that he did care much about his schooling.
Yeah.
And I mean, so much so that when he was struggling in math, right, he got a
Yeah.
tutor to help him. And but could you actually just kind of talk about his
Yeah.
class rank and his standing within West Point just a little bit?
Yeah. So he takes his studies very seriously. He sees West Point as an opportunity to expand himself. I mean, he's checking out, all kinds of books about all sorts of things from the library that weren't necessarily connected to his studies. But I mean, the guy who really is critical is Henry Slocum, right? So the guy who
Right.
goes on to become a corps commander during the Civil War. I mean, Slocum is the one who tutors him, and Sheridan really kind of maintains kind of a solid academic standing. Like, he's not the worst student, he's not the best student, he's always in the middle of the pack, essentially average, or slightly above average, until you get to that moment, right, where his temper gets the better of him. And there are those moments in his life where he just lashes out. Like, he loses all sense of decorum, and he just lashes out. So, I write about, and this is a story that he wrote about in his memoirs with, some regret in retrospect, the almost stabbing Sergeant William Terrell, because Terrell told him, dress, and Sheridan thought, well, I'm dressed. And then, Sheridan makes an advance against him with his bayonet. And then at the last moment, Sheridan pulls it back into his shoulder, realizing with that good angel sitting on his shoulder, like, probably shouldn't do that. And then it's after that when he gets into it with Terrell and starts punching him in the head. And then he gets expelled for almost a year from West Point.
Yeah. Well, something that's really interesting, and you talk so much about his personality, and and you really, really speak well of this, which is just kind of like the strange contrast in who Sheridan is. And it's interesting to see how often he would lose his temper, and he would get angry, and he would lash out. But then at times he would go back and he would go and apologize to those people. But I know I'm bringing this up a little bit early here, but Governor Warren, he is one of the people that he lashed out after the Battle of Five Forks due to Governor Warren's delay, but some of that being to Sheridan's own fault. What's interesting to me, though, is that Sheridan does not go back to Warren and apologize.
Yeah.
And I'm just kind of curious your thoughts as to why that is.
Yeah. So Sheridan, he's an interesting personality, right? And so, one of the things that I wanted to do when I was writing the book is really try to help people understand, who he is and what makes him tick, not just what he did, because the what he did part of his life, I mean, that's pretty easy to address, but really try to understand the intricacies of who he was as a person and as a military officer. And so, I mean, you're 100% correct in that Sheridan, there are numerous moments, right? So there's a moment I write about before Stones River where he apologized to an Illinois regiment. There's a moment after Fisher's Hill where he apologizes to Colonel Edward Molyneux, a brigade commander. But then there are these moments like Gouverneur K. Warren, William Averell, cavalry commander after Fisher's Hill. And I came to the conclusion that if Sheridan doesn't like you, he just doesn't like you. Like, there is nothing he's ever going to do. But it's interesting to me, and I think Grant comes into the conversation here.
Okay.
So, when you look at William Averell, who I write in the book, I think he was treated, very, very unfairly by Bill Sheridan. And then you have the Gouverneur K. Warren episode after Five Forks. And what's interesting to me in both of those moments, there's communications that Grant has with Sheridan beforehand about each of these guys. And so, when Sheridan took command in the Valley in 1864, there are communications between Grant and Sheridan where Grant basically is saying, if you don't like Averell, and Sheridan was kind of giving the sense that there's a personality conflict. I don't think he's going to fit into the culture I'm trying to create in the Army of the Shenandoah. Grant's like, if you want to get rid of him, you can just go get rid of him. And so I think when Grant tells Sheridan something like this, Sheridan's thinking, okay, I have the green light from the boss, and all I need is that moment. I need that excuse, right? And so you kind of fast forward to the Gouverneur K. Warren episode, And I think it's kind of a similar situation. And so, I always tell my students, like, multiple things can be true at the same time, right? And so, Sheridan makes all kind of mistakes at Five Forks. And one of the biggest, of course, is him misjudging the distance where the Confederate flank is, and that contributes to Gouverneur K. Warren's delay. But Warren, when Grant sent Sheridan Gouverneur K. Warren's Fifth Corps, Grant wrote a letter to Sheridan basically saying Warren has, and the word that Grant used is deficiencies. And so he has deficiencies. And so if you see any cause to, remove him from command, just go ahead and do it.
Yeah.
And, I think the further you dig into the Grant-Warren relationship, I think Grant had all kind of problems with Gouverneur K. Warren.
Yeah.
And so this is one of those moments where Sheridan's kind of like the hatchet man for Grant in this episode. And so looking for a reason to get rid of Warren and Five Forks, for better or worse, it gives Sheridan and consequently Grant the reason for doing that.
Yeah. In just a full circle, I suppose, just a tidbit about Gouverneur Warren, he actually did something similar to one of his subordinate officers at Cold Harbor, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And one of his officers said, "Are you sure you want to relieve him from command? I mean, he didn't know where the flank was." And, and Gouverneur Warren said, "No, it's fine." But before I get too much ahead of myself here, so let's talk a little bit about just kind of, he leaves West Point and he actually goes out west. What experience does he pick up out west that's really going to translate into his meteoric rise in the Civil War?
Yeah, so there's a couple, right? So I think when, one of his first posts coming out of West Point is along the Rio Grande. And so I think when he is in Texas, that's where you start to see like the cultivation of Sheridan, the leader.
Yeah.
And so it's something that today we might think is really simple, but it was something very powerful to him. I mean, he spends a lot of time writing about this in his memoirs. And it's helping his men deal with scurvy, right? And so there's not a lot of vegetables and produce along the border for his men to eat to prevent scurvy, but there is that plant that comes from the agave family, where you kind of squeeze the plant and you get the juice. It's called pulque, and you let it ferment, and it smells like rotten meat. And of course, it's not palatable. People don't want to drink it. And when Sheridan realizes his men aren't wanting to drink this stuff, he understands like the only way they're going to do it is if I do it in front of them. And so every morning at roll call, he's downing his ration of pulque, and his men, of course, follow suit. And Sheridan, I think from that moment, all throughout his entire military career, understood that you have to lead by example. Like, he understood that the troops are what matter. You have to keep the troops well fed. You have to keep them healthy. You have to keep them happy. And I think undeniably Sheridan loved and cared for his men deeply. And I think you see that, him starting to understand that when he's in Texas, and then when he's out in the Pacific Northwest, I think he also starts to understand what leadership does not look like. So you think about, I write about Gilbert Raines's campaign against the Yakima and Chief Kamiakin. And, it's a disastrous military campaign. It occurs in very snowy, blizzard-like conditions. And so I think Sheridan at that moment in the mid-1850s kind of gathers a really healthy appreciation for Mother Nature and the role that the environment can have on military campaigns. But I think he also understands what military leadership does not look like or should not look like in defeat, because Raines takes none of the responsibility for what happens. I mean, he could have said, "Oh, made a mistake, should have turned back. I didn't." He starts throwing other guys under the bus, in essence, and Sheridan is really put off by this. And that's one of the things that, I know Sheridan has his detractors. And as I told a group I was speaking to a couple weeks ago about Sheridan in the book, like, I don't think any serious historian writes a biography because they either love the person or hate the person. right? They write the biography because they think that person's life can reveal something significant, not only about the individual, but about that moment in history in which they exist. And so I don't think there's a moment in Sheridan's military career really where if something goes badly, he's automatically just blaming his men and not accepting any of the responsibility himself. And so that's a really, I think, critical part of his development. And then also, when you start to see the transition from Pacific Northwest, coming to Missouri, when the Civil War breaks out, I think you really start to see, Sheridan's complete devotion to the United States. When James Archer comes out to take command of the post out there, he's a Maryland Confederate basically, and he's like, I'm gonna, make sure the Confederates get everything out here of any value. And Sheridan refused to turn over command to him.
Right.
And that to me is one of those moments like, Sheridan is ordered east, but I don't think Sheridan is ever going to do anything. Like he does not have a problem going against orders if he believes it's in the best interest of the country or the best interest of his men. And so like he does that when he's out in the Pacific Northwest in the spring of 61. He does it at Missionary Ridge. So there are these moments in his life. And I think all of that, of course, starts to really germinate in those pre-war years.
Well, probably the most impressive thing he does early on in the Civil War is the fact that he impresses General Halleck, of all people. Yeah. That was a rarity to do, especially early on. So if you want to talk just a little bit about that and kind of his time as a quartermaster and whatever else.
Yeah, I mean, Halleck is someone, when he comes to Missouri, I mean, Sheridan is the one that kind of helps Halleck untangle the whole John C. Fremont mess. And he's very much, moved and inspired by what Sheridan is able to do. But he's kind of looking at Sheridan saying, wow, great organizational skills, great mind, very talented person. We probably should be using those talents to fight the Confederates and not investigate John C. Fremont. And so, Sheridan, ends up becoming, as quartermaster and commissary for the Army of the Southwest, and really does, great work in that regard. And then you get to this point in, by the spring of 1862, where Sheridan, goes from captain to colonel of the 2nd Michigan Cavalry, and then he's off to the races. Once he gets that commission as commander of the 2nd Michigan, it's really like several weeks, and he's a brigade commander, and he's getting promoted to brigadier. Like it's crazy. But the reason he rises so quickly, I think Halleck plays a part in this. I mean, Halleck is a great admirer of Sheridan, but Sheridan has the ability to very quickly, I think, get his men behind him. And so you think about everywhere that Sheridan is at, from cavalry regimental commander all the way through, Army of the Potomac Cavalry Corps and then the Shenandoah Valley. He is very frequently having to reinvent himself and reintroduce himself to his command and get the command on board, because again, these guys aren't going to fight if they don't feel a sense of connection and they don't trust him. And he does that. And I think the fact that he does it so quickly is one of those reasons that he has this sort of meteoric rise. And, not to fast forward too much, but, this was a quality that Ulysses S. Grant admired in Sheridan. When he was making the pitch to Lincoln and Stanton in the summer of 1864, to have Sheridan be made commander of the Army of the Shenandoah, after Grant went through a litany of other generals, including Meade and William B. Franklin, he said that Sheridan possesses one quality that none of the others have, and that is his magnetic personality, his ability to inspire and encourage his men and make them believe they could do the impossible.
Do you think, particularly in the Western theater, was there a specific moment or event that really permitted him to take command out east? Because and this is the way that I look at it. I mean, it sounds like his relationship with Grant is actually, and look, I'm an admirer of Grant. I like the guy, but I will say it seems to be that Grant has a tendency to really bring up his friends as well as protect those, and we can probably talk about this later, but also protect those that he is very friendly toward. And so you might disagree, and that's completely fine. But I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, to speak to the first point, you know, what's kind of that early significant moment in the war? I think it's the Battle of Boonville, Mississippi, July 1862. So small engagement that most people don't even know about. But this is a moment where, you know, Sheridan puts on display his tactical abilities, right? And so he's in the Boonville area several days before that battle is fought. And he does something that I don't think maybe enough of commanders did. He tried to work out in his mind, what are if I'm attacked, what are the different directions an attack can come from? How can I respond? And so he does a massive reconnaissance of the area, understands roads and paths. And when the Confederates cavalry does eventually attack him, he is able to basically sandwich them in the middle. So he attacks them from the front, uses roads to get around and behind them, and then defeats them soundly. And this is a moment that I think Sheridan was tremendously proud of, because he had, you know, great tactical abilities on display. This is one of those moments, by the way, that like Sheridan's detractors, Isaac Pennypacker, who was, you know, many decades after the Civil War, very powerful Philadelphia editor, and a great aficionado of George Meade, goes after Sheridan saying, yeah, but he lied about the amount of troops that he was engaged against. So Sheridan, you know, he didn't embellish the numbers. He was going off of reports from POWs. It's like, I had like 800 guys and they had 4,000 or whatever the number was, and I won. And Sheridan never corrected that. And so that's one of those moments where people go after Sheridan and say he's nothing but a glory hound. But then on the other side of the coin, there are cavalry officers in the regular army in the early 1900s who are studying cavalry tactics, and they're like, yeah, the numbers might have been inaccurate, but wow, look at what Sheridan did. Like, how masterful was that in terms of trying to anticipate where attacks would come from, and you have all these different options. But yeah, I think to go to your other part of your question about Grant, I think you're right. In that Grant had his favorites, right? And he would always go to bat for Sheridan. There's a lot of moments. I mean, I think he greatly admires Sheridan, you know, for what he does at Missionary Ridge. I think that is kind of that moment, one of those catalysts that Grant says, I'm going to bring him east with me. But you think about the exchanges that, you know, Sheridan and Meade have when Sheridan comes to Virginia in the spring of 1864, and they're not pleasant at all, because these two guys are at odds without, you know, about how cavalry should be used. And in all of those instances, Grant always takes Sheridan's side. And that obviously has to be extremely frustrating for George Gordon Meade. But I mean, I think Grant and Sheridan had a really special relationship. I mean, it's cultivated, it evolves during the Civil War. You know, the things that Sheridan does during Reconstruction, the things that he does with indigenous peoples when Grant is president, Grant signs off on all that stuff because he believes in what Sheridan is doing, doesn't feel that he should ever question what Sheridan does. And it really, you know, I spent a lot of time with Sheridan over the past 2+ decades with my work in the Valley, but I didn't really truly realize until writing this book how strong their relationship was, not just on the battlefield, but off as well. And, you know, one of the things that I did that other Sheridan biographers did not is use Grant's papers. I mean, there was so much insight into papers of Ulysses S. Grant about that relationship. I mean, these guys are going on vacation with each other after the war, you know, going to Mexico, going to Cuba. And I mean, these guys have an unbreakable bond. I actually kind of think, I think I was telling Chris Mikowski a couple weeks ago, like I think of the great trio of Union generals, and this is just my take, people can disagree, Sherman, Grant, and Sheridan. I think that Sheridan was slightly above Sherman in terms of Grant's favorites. And I think about, what happens at the end of the war in Virginia. Grant is sending Sheridan to Mexico or to the border to deal with Maximilian, but Sherman and his army is able to come to DC for the Grand Review. But yeah, I mean, I think you're 100% correct in that Grant absolutely, he has his favorites and he will stick by them pretty much no matter what.
Yeah. Well, going back to that relationship that you were talking about with George Gordon Meade, I'm curious your opinion on this, which is George Gordon Meade and Sheridan, they get into a very bad argument after the Battle of the Wilderness. And it comes down to ultimately Sheridan saying, if you let me go, whip Jeb Stuart, I will. Do you think that Sheridan's ability to actually go and do exactly what he said he was going to do actually gave him a lot more leniency with Grant, and especially the fact that he was successful with that? And did it also encourage Grant maybe to think about placing him in command out in the Shenandoah? Do you think that influenced it at all?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the things that Grant told Meade at this point, when Sheridan's like, I want to go after Stuart, Grant basically says to Meade, like, Sheridan's very rarely wrong, right? And so to have that statement, then to go out and do it, and of course all the ripple effects from Yellow Tavern and Stuart's death, all those types of things. So yeah, I think it certainly builds up the trust that Grant has in Sheridan. And when Grant is thinking about who can finally get the job done in the Valley, that has to be in the back of Grant's mind, right? Yeah. And so, I mean, Sheridan was not Grant's first choice, but when you run through the Democrat William B. Franklin, and Lincoln's like, nope, don't think so. And I mean, Grant also suggests George Meade, and there's a whole bunch of considerations that Lincoln's like, no, I'm not going to do that because people have been wanting me to get rid of Meade since Gettysburg. And so, he settles on Sheridan, but I really think that Grant believes that Sheridan can get the job done because he kind of does what he says he's going to do. Yeah.
And kind of getting more towards his campaign in the Shenandoah Valley, that really seems to be something that you've studied for a very long time. And in fact, for our listeners out there, you've also written another book on the Battle of Fisher's Hill. So just a quick plug there. But would you like to actually just kind of address and talk about Sheridan's performance in the Shenandoah and his role?
Yeah, so it's interesting because when Sheridan first comes to command in the Valley in early August of 1864, there is, like all situations, a range of reactions to his appointment to command. So there are Union soldiers who are like, he's going to be like General Banks, like he's not going to win in the Valley.
Right.
There are others who are saying, he's going to win, and others are just saying, like, let's just wait and see. So there's never a singular reaction to anything like that. But you start to see, in those initial weeks, like people saying maybe this guy is going to go the way of a General Banks or a Franz Sigel, because, I mean, they're basically marching in a circle, right? I mean, they're moving from the area of Harper's Ferry to Fisher's Hill. There's some minor skirmishing, but a whole bunch of movement in extreme heat conditions. I mean, even his brother, who's in a 100-day Ohio regiment in the early part of the campaign, is like, I think my brother is just outmatched in this. Like, I don't think he is right for the job. And then, but what people don't understand sometimes is Sheridan very rarely is just doing things on his own. Like, he doesn't just wake up one morning and say, oh, I'm going to do this. And so the reason he is involved in what one Union soldier called a mimic war is because of Lincoln and Grant. because they're telling him, like, when we send you to the valley, we want you to win, but we also don't want you to lose. So you don't attack Jubal early unless you're 100% certain of victory. And so, Sheridan is very tenuous. He's very pragmatic. And then you get to that moment in, the early part of the second week of September, where Lincoln is looking at the election and he's saying, okay, we have this army of 40,000 men in the valley. That's great and wonderful. But if they don't do anything, like, I don't want Sheridan to lose, but if they're just in the valley and they don't do anything, well, that doesn't look good. And so that kind of kicks things into gear. And you have the meeting between Grant and Sheridan in Charlestown. And then we're off to the races with, 3rd Winchester and Fisher's Hill, Tom's Brook and Cedar Creek. And every, battle that, you go throughout that 1864 Shenandoah campaign, every victory he wins, it elevates his status. It elevates him by, late October to the status of rock star, in essence. And, if you look at Cedar Creek, Cedar Creek, that battle that kind of culminates, significant operations in the valley. This is a moment where, when it starts, Phil Sheridan isn't there. He's in Winchester. And then Horatio Wright, who's a temporary army commander who essentially disregarded all of the instructions that Sheridan gave before Sheridan left for Washington, D.C. And then Sheridan arrives. And I know people, sometimes have a penchant to want to, like, downplay a larger than life figure. And there are some people today who want to make the case, well, Horatio Wright reorganizes the army. And he does, to an extent.
Yeah.
North of Middletown. But Horatio Wright's also the reason that the army was in the position it was and needed to be reorganized, because he's the one who, disregarded Sheridan's get him up at 2:30 in the morning order. He shifted cavalry from the far left to the far right. So he kind of created that environment. But, as a historian, I'm always interested in what people are writing in the moment, not, decades after, because, not all primary sources are created equal. And so there's a letter that Horatio Wright wrote to his wife after the Battle of Cedar Creek. And he said that I was so glad when Sheridan arrived, because he had the ability to do something that I could not. And that was inspire the men by his mere presence. And so, you look at accounts on the opposite side, the Confederate side, when Sheridan arrived, 10:30 that morning, Confederates are writing in their journals. There's one that I cite in the book. Henry Robinson Berkeley said the Confederates could hear this massive chorus, these shouts coming from the Union line. And he said, well, the army of the Shenandoah must have received some reinforcement. And it did. It was one person in Phil Sheridan. And so, like, those are the powerful moments that validate what Grant, why Grant chose him to lead that army.
Sure. Well, and maybe you could take it a step farther to even say that Sheridan was even a great teacher for Wright to show aggressiveness, because from what it seems, before Horatio Wright was ever with Sheridan, he was a little bit more hesitant to attack. He wasn't as aggressive. But go fast forward to 1865, when Horatio Wright is on the line around Petersburg, and he tells Grant, he's like, I'm ready to go in. And Grant says, that's great. And I think a lot of that has to do with Sheridan's inspiration, as you already touched on. Well, I'm curious here. Do you think that the Battle of Cedar Creek, do you think that battle actually overshadows Sheridan's performance at Appomattox in terms of the way people remembered him? Because I would, in my own opinion, I would argue Appomattox, he actually performed a lot better. That was phenomenal. But I'm curious, though, based upon just kind of like the memory and just kind of the story behind it, I'm curious if that really overshadowed that or something of that sort.
Yeah, it's interesting. I would agree. So if you think about it from a purely military standpoint, I think what he does in the Appomattox campaign is remarkable. Yeah. And there are, soldiers outside of Sheridan's command, political figures outside of Sheridan's command, who are basically making the case, like if Sheridan doesn't do what he does and, getting through those gaps in the Confederate line, like Appomattox could go very differently.
Right.
Like he is the critical figure in all of that. But as important as that was, there aren't any poems written about it. Right. And so part of the book is memory.
Right.
And so like after Cedar Creek, you have Thomas Buchanan Reed, less than 2 weeks later, and you've got the recitation of that poem at Pike's Opera House in Cincinnati by Murdoch, the great Shakespearean actor. And then you see, songs and paintings and all that kind of stuff. And it's interesting to me because there are these moments right throughout his military career. Appomattox has to be like his crowning achievement during the Civil War, but it's Cedar Creek that he's remembered for the most.
Yeah.
And I think it's due in part large to the poetry and the songs and the art and the sculptures and the way that he's immortalized in bronze are all, with exception of one, kind of trying to freeze that moment in time. And so it's interesting because when you even look at like his funeral, at St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington, D.C., Catholic Cardinal Gibbons, who presides over the Requiem Mass, he eulogizes Sheridan, and he spends a significant chunk of his eulogy talking about Cedar Creek and Sheridan's ride.
Yeah.
So like, I always find that very telling. There's so many moments in the guy's military career you could talk about, but you're focused on that. And not to take anything away from the significance of it, but like it is so popularized, that moment, like that's what the people know. And so, yeah.
Do you think that plays into the memory, like the memory piece of him? So like when people would look at the statues and everything else, like the first thing they're going to think about is the ride to Cedar Creek, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool.
Absolutely.
Well, let's get to the most interesting part of his life, which is kind of crazy to me because I've met several people that have said, his Civil War stuff is interesting, but what he did after the Civil War is probably more interesting, which I tend to agree with. So do you just kind of want to talk a little bit? Number one, you had mentioned before, he actually sent to the Texas border, and this is kind of a weird episode that's often forgotten about in American history.
Yep.
If you want to talk about that, and then like his role in Louisiana and all that.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, Sheridan, when the war ends in Virginia, Grant sends him to the border because Grant actually, I mean, he wrote something to the effect of like, I don't ever really truly believe we can declare complete victory over the Confederacy until the issue in Mexico with Maximilian is decided, because Mexico was seen as a place of refuge for former Confederates. And so Grant obviously had this concern about, colonies forming there and reinvigorating the Confederate war effort, and then launching, Civil War 2.0 in essence. And so, Sheridan deals with that, and Sheridan would have just loved to go in and just attack Mexico. I mean, that's his aggressive nature.
Right. Yeah.
And of course, Secretary Seward is like, yeah, no, we're not. It's not really the best idea at this stage of the game. So, I mean, he deals with that, and he's finding all kind of curious ways, with Grant's approval, to funnel, arms and munitions, surplus stock, like you just happen to have 30,000 muskets lying around that you're not doing anything with, and just happen to put them along the Rio Grande so that the opposition can get them. But one of the aspects of that post-war life that Sheridan doesn't get enough of attention, and really no attention on, is how he becomes such a great ally of African Americans.
Yeah.
And there are always questions that any historian has when they're going into a project, and I had multiple questions, and one of them was like, what is his real attitude towards slavery and Black people and suffrage and civil rights and those types of things? Because Sheridan doesn't write really a great deal about it at all in his memoirs. I mean, he kind of hints at, he kind of gives this sense that abolitionists are agitators, and he, in 1861, he's not really all that pleased with them. But then Sheridan, you go throughout the war, he has different experiences and interactions with African Americans. He helps them as much as he can. And then after the war, when he's in Louisiana during Reconstruction, I mean, he is a great ally and friend, and he goes, unsurprisingly, very aggressive after the Klan, very aggressive after white supremacists, very aggressively after any former Confederate who doesn't recognize, that slavery is constitutionally dead, and all those types of things. And one of the things that was very striking for me is that Sheridan was a great advocate of the 15th Amendment. So much so that when he is out and about, he is giving speeches in favor of giving Black people the right to vote. And this, the book has 10 documents at the end that focus on different aspects of his life. And I put one of those speeches in there. And again, these are all parts of Sheridan that I think others haven't really touched on before. I remember speaking at the Emerging Civil War Symposium a couple years ago, and Brian Jordan, one of my good friends, was there. And I was telling him about, like, oh my God, you're not going to believe this speech that I just found that Sheridan gave in favor of the 15th Amendment. And so, one of the goals is I'm hoping that people understand that, Sheridan is a very complex guy, and he evolves in his attitudes toward Black people and suffrage. But what's interesting about this is, as much of an ally as he was for Black people, and he believed essentially that they had earned the right, by fighting and making their contributions during the war, they had earned the right to full citizenship. As much as he was an advocate for them, that's as much as he detested Indigenous peoples. Like, he is.
What do you think what do you think the dichotomy of that is?
Yeah, so I think Sheridan never, ever, there's a couple of things. So one, I think Sheridan's a great proponent of manifest destiny, right?
Okay.
And so I think he sees Indigenous peoples as a great obstacle to that. I think he sees them as, and I hate to say this, he sees them as less than human. He sees them as savages. He sees them as uncivilized. And so it's interesting because, sometimes you see generals who were great advocates for Black people during and after the war are also very sympathetic to Indigenous peoples. So, like, Robert Milroy, for instance, I wrote a biography of him back in 2006, and he was that kind of person. I mean, he was, very much in favor of Black suffrage, and also became a great ally for Indigenous peoples. Sheridan is not that way at all, because Sheridan, I think, sees this very sharp dividing line. Like, you are not in any way valuable or useful to what the federal government sees as the vision of America in the 1860s or 1870s. And therefore, you need to go. And I'm pretty blunt about this in the book. So anyone who would ever accuse me of being you just love the guy, I mean, I basically say he's a proponent of ethnic cleansing. And so, I mean, Sheridan really wanted to root out and eliminate all Indigenous culture, because he thought that it was a great obstacle. He thought that it just didn't fit with what the government wanted to do. And his loyalty was always to the government. And so if the government would have said, let's do things differently, I think he probably would have gone along with that. But Sheridan, I think, just sees them as a great obstacle.
Okay. And I could be making a stretch here, so you tell me.
Mm-hmm.
So going all the way back, even before he was born, his parents, he's a first generation American, because he immigrates from, well,
right.
We don't know if he was born,
right. Yeah.
In the United States or on the ship that's coming from Ireland. There's
Right.
not a lot of definitive evidence on that. But needless to say, do you think, because he is a first generation American, do you think that it's possible that he has a lot more pride, and there's this sense that kind of being American is like kind of this important thing for him, and that's why, like, aligning with the government in their policies is so critical for him?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think you're right. I think Sheridan always throughout his life has this great love, this great affinity for America. I think he recognizes whether he's born in Ireland as a baby, comes across, born in
Yeah.
the Atlantic, born in Albany, born somewhere else.
Yeah.
Um, and we'll never know because of his
Yeah.
mom,
Yeah.
right? Where ultimately he was born. But I think he takes that to heart. And so Sheridan is always going to toe the government line. And anything that Sheridan believes stands in the way of the government's goals, he's going to go after it aggressively. And so, one of the things, I mean, so I think that in part explains why he does what he does and why he supports, inhumane, ill treatment of indigenous peoples. And I think it also speaks to the reality of him really not feeling any sense of desire to reconcile with former Confederates. So
Mm.
there's an episode in the book where I write about in the 1880s, John B. Gordon, former Confederate Corps commander by the end of the war, writes Sheridan and says, we're trying to raise money to help disabled Confederate veterans. Can you help? And Sheridan basically is like, I mean, you're reading between the lines what he writes. I mean, he's polite in the response, but basically, if you read between the lines, he's like, you were traitors. If you lost an arm, you shouldn't have seceded. I don't feel sorry for you. Deal with it. And so because he saw them as trying to break the thing that he loved so much. And so he never, when they were trying to return the Confederate flags for the first time, he went off about that, how egregious that was. And so, yeah, I think you can certainly make that argument that it goes back to, his recognition. I am here. I'm first generation. I love this country. Anything in this country that threatens the country that the government wants to create, I'm going to go after aggressively.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and one other topic that you touched on, just like in terms of his religion, and this part I actually found really fascinating, which was number one, I actually did not know he was Catholic. That was actually a little bit of a surprise to me because, as you already pointed out, there was nothing that he wasn't very religious. There was really nothing to indicate that he was very devout. I mean, contrary to like William Rosecrans, who was very devout.
Right.
But then after Sheridan passes away, do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's so interesting.
He becomes super Catholic, right?
Right. Yeah.
And I'm saying this as someone who is I'm Catholic, and so I find it fascinating because you think about and I think it starts at his funeral. So Cardinal Gibbons, who presides over the funeral mass, talks a lot about Sheridan's ride, but he also talks about how great and devout a Catholic Sheridan was. And I think there is this effort, because if you look at America at this time, I mean, there's not a lot of, there's a lot of angst from, Protestant Americans toward Catholic Americans because they feel that, Catholics are always going to, give their loyalty to the Pope over a president.
Yeah.
And so it's being Catholic and being a good American Republic citizen are incompatible with each other. And so, Sheridan is kind of cast into this person who can be, a devout Catholic and also be this great, wonderful, patriotic American doing what the government asks him and not, just following what the Pope wants him to do. And this carries on. I mean, so like there's an illustration in a Catholic newspaper that kind of shows Sheridan. I don't have this in the book, but I describe it where basically Sheridan, is being carried into heaven, clutching a crucifix.
Right.
There is the image I have of Sheridan in the book in his coffin where he's holding a cross, which probably, I'm not going to dig him up, but probably he was holding because he is Catholic. But it's interesting, like you go through, even into like the 1960s, 100 years after the Civil War, where he is still being portrayed as this great Catholic American during the Civil War centennial. There's a comic book that I reference in the biography where it's a whole comic strip about Phil Sheridan, and it culminates with a group of nuns in Washington D.C. standing before the monument that Gutzon Borglum created, and basically saying, you know, there's our great Catholic American hero. And then they go on to say, like, one of his sons went on to become a priest, which isn't true, because he only had one son, Phil Jr., and he died in his mid-30s from heart disease. And he followed in his dad's footsteps as a military guy. And I think whoever created that comic strip was probably thinking about Sherman's kids, not Sheridan's.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's very, very interesting. I mean, there are like Knights of Columbus councils that still exist today that are named after Phil Sheridan. And, you know, traditionally when they're named after saints or priests or, you know, other types of holy figures. And I wouldn't put Sheridan in that category, you know, of a saint.
Well, you know, I'm sure Sherman and Sheridan probably had a lot to talk about when it came to Catholicism.
Oh yeah.
Well, getting more to the memory piece of it, earlier I had mentioned his wife, Irene Sheridan. Could you just talk to us about how she actually is going to be very influential, not in the same way as as you mentioned, you know, with Pickett's wife, but she is going to be influential with Sheridan's memory. And so if you could speak on that.
Yeah, this was something I didn't anticipate, right? So when I was writing the book, because no one had really, there wasn't a great deal already published about her, and I thought, well, there mustn't be much. True. And then I started to dig, and I thought, wow, what a remarkable woman Irene Sheridan was. And I mean, she kind of she knew how her husband wanted to be portrayed, right? As a general who loved his men, very aggressive on the battlefield. And when he died in 1888, she was as aggressive as he was in terms of protecting and defending his memory. So, you know, Frank Burr and Richard Hinton, one of the episodes I write about, they were great admirers of Sheridan. And a couple months after, well, actually a couple of weeks after Sheridan's funeral, you know, Mrs. Sheridan's reading a newspaper and she's like, oh, what is this biography that's going to be published about my husband? And she wasn't ever bothered by people writing about him. And by the time that he died, there were already, you know, 5 biographies written about Sheridan. So she knew he would be the subject, but she was bothered by the fact that, you know, Frank Burr said, oh, he was an intimate friend of mine. And she's like, no, he wasn't. He had served with him in the 2nd Michigan Cavalry. He was a sergeant. But what really bothered Mrs. Sheridan is that Burr and Hinton claimed that Sheridan consulted on the biography, that he had read the manuscript and offered comments. And she's like, no, he doesn't. And so there's this whole campaign to go after those 2 authors, not knowing what's going to be in the book, right? So it's this quick knee-jerk reaction. And I think if she would have just kind of tempered herself, she would have been happy, because it just paints Sheridan in these very, you know, lofty sort of romantic terms. But where she really controls things is within how he's depicted in monuments. And so, you know, the monument that's in DC, the one that was sculpted by Gutzon Borglum, he wasn't the original sculptor. And so John Quincy Adams Ward was the original sculptor, and Ward wanted to portray Phil Sheridan at the end of his military career as commanding general of the Army. And Mrs. Sheridan, that wasn't the way that she wanted her husband portrayed. And quite frankly, according to her, Sheridan didn't want to be portrayed in that light either, because they spent a lot of time walking around DC when he was commanding general, and they were looking at monuments, some of which were sculpted by Ward. And he's like, the generals are so stiff, the horses are undersized, they look foolish. Make sure, if I'm ever cast in bronze, make sure I'm not sculpted in that manner. And so, you know, John Quincy Adams Ward, his statue ultimately is placed in front of the state capitol in Albany, New York. But Mrs. Sheridan, you know, she goes after Ward. She's like, it's terrible. It's inaccurate. This is not how he should be portrayed. And ultimately, the contract with Ward is killed. And so Gutzon Borglum gets the contract. And then there's a lawsuit that happens. And then ultimately, Daniel Chester French, who is the most known for sculpture of Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial in DC, he was, mentored by John Quincy Adams Ward. And so he had this desire to like get, Ward statues somewhere. And eventually the citizens of Albany, they came 1914, if memory serves, and said, we want that statue. And Mrs. Sheridan intervened again. She's like, I hate it. It's terrible. This is not how he should be depicted. And the Albany committee basically told Mrs. Sheridan, just like, relax, calm down. We don't care that you don't like this. That's what's going up, because other artists have said it's a great likeness of your husband. And so it's there today. So, yeah, I mean, I make the point in the book that, you have widows of generals. You have General Pickett's, widow. You have General Hancock's widow. Like, those are kind of the two that we always think of as trying to control how their husbands are remembered. But I think Irene Sheridan deserves a little bit in that regard. I mean, she's not going out and giving lectures and writing, but she is exerting enormous influence in how he's portrayed in art. And the way that most people are going to form opinions about what type of a person Sheridan was by looking at his public art. Because they're not going to read his memoirs, they're not going to read biographies, but they're going to pass that statue and say, wow, he must have been a daring, dashing guy, versus the Albany statue where he's just, stiff and already starting to bloat up from fluid because he has heart disease. And so, yeah, I think she deserves, some recognition in that regard as being someone who is really trying to shape the narrative of how her husband should be remembered.
So then how is the narrative shaped, and how should we remember Sheridan?
Yeah, so I'm gonna answer this with the last couple words of the book: a massive contradictions. So he is a liberator, he is an oppressor, he is sometimes fair, sometimes unreasonable. He is human, right? And so I have these discussions with my students all the time about, like, we want to cast someone as this or that. Maybe they're all of those things. And I think Sheridan is all of those things. I mean, he, certainly deserves to be celebrated for what, the role that he plays in Union victory, in his great support for Black suffrage. But my God, the abominable things he does to indigenous peoples before the war, after the war in particular, they're egregious, right? And so I think he is a massive contradictions.
Well, again, we are here with Jonathan Noyalas, author of Philip Sheridan, Life, War, and Memory. Thank you again so much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.